that they're not paying any attention to what's actually going on, and he calls these people out of the darkness, these creatures out of the darkness. So you get these black, you can hardly see them there, but they're black cloaked figures with glowing eyes, and they're shutting the door of the amusement park. And that's very interesting. It's an extraordinarily interesting happening. It's like, okay, so all of a sudden the amusement park is associated, we already know that the coachman is up to no good, but now he's got these minions that are faceless in some sense. They're clearly creatures of the night, and they're up to no good. And so you have the sense that the boys are being offered bread in circuses, roughly speaking, but there's a real reason for it. There's a manipulative reason for it. They're being enticed into a trap, and the doors are closed, and these underground beings are involved in the plot, and obviously the coachman understands this perfectly well. And so one of the ways to understand this is to think about what totalitarian states have to offer their populace and what they offer them. And this happened particularly as Rome declined, let's say. That's where the term bread and circuses originally came from, is that as the situation degenerates, then people have to be offered stupid amusements more and more frequently in order for them to ignore what's actually going on in the background. And, you know, a war can be that kind of stupid amusement. Anyways, later that night, the entire place is completely devastated, and all we see is the wreckage of everything that was there before. And again, the cricket has got separated from Pinocchio, and so he's trying to find him, and Pinocchio ends up in this bar that's shaped like an 8-ball. 8-ball is kind of the random ball in pool. And anyways, he's inside the 8-ball, and he's shooting pool with Lampwick, and that's just another indication of wasting his time, basically. And you can see in the forefront there's some cards for gambling, and so he's engaged in these sort of, you might say, pointless, hedonic pursuits, and he's enticing Pinocchio along the same route. And so he teaches him to smoke first. That doesn't go very well. So Pinocchio takes a huge drag on a cigar, and it just about kills him. And when Lampwick asks him how he likes it, he shakes his head and says, you know, that was really quite good, but he's so sick that he can hardly stand up, and he's hallucinating double balls on the pool table. And then the cricket shows up and stands on the 8-ball and kind of gives one of those declamatory speeches again, you know, because he still hasn't quite figured out that standing up proud and spouting off the rules isn't exactly the right way for the conscience to behave. And Lampwick picks him up by the scruff of the neck, roughly speaking, and first of all asks who he is. So obviously he's divorced from his own conscience, and then makes fun of Pinocchio for paying attention to this little bug. And that's kind of a nice indication of what happens in adolescence, you know, because of course as children move away from their parents and into their groups, especially when the groups are misbehaving, often what happens is that the other members of the group will torture a person who isn't willing to try something dangerous or foolish by making fun of the fact that they're, you know, too attached to their conscience. And there's a positive element to that, because you should take some risks when you're a teenager and also later in life. And so if you won't take any risks, there's actually something wrong with you. But there's a negative element in that, well, you know, teenagers do all sorts of stupid things, and perhaps it's amazing that we all live through it, actually, as far as I'm concerned. And some people take extraordinary risks, and they don't make it through at all, or they end up in the permanently antisocial population, and then they're, you know, basically career criminals. 5% of the criminals commit 95% of the crimes. It's another Pareto distribution. So anyways, Lampwick isn't going to listen to Pinocchio or to the cricket. He laughs at him with this kind of braying laugh, which is some foreshadowing, and the cricket gets all upset, puts his coat on backwards, and ends up dumped down a pool table hole and otherwise abused. And so he stomps on out of there. He tells Pinocchio that he can take care of himself, and he stomps on out of there. And so Pinocchio is left without the guidance of conscience, and the cricket is trying to figure out how to get off Pleasure Island. But he goes through the gates and he sees what's actually going on. And what's going on is that the coachman has this like slave boat down in the bowels of the island, and he's got all these black suited minions with the glowing eyes working for him, and they're rounding up what look like donkeys. And so they're beasts of burden, right? And so there's an idea here that if you pursue impulsive pleasure to the detriment of the development of your character, you're going to end up a beast of burden. You're going to end up a slave to a tyrant. And that's exactly right. And so anyways, the cricket doesn't, you can see one of those black suited horrors here hauling donkeys out of this crate, and one of them has a hat on, and they look very sad, and they're in different crates, and one of them says sold to the salt mines, and one says sold to the circus, and so they're shipped off to be slaves, roughly speaking, and they look very sad. And then one of them gets hauled out of a crate, and he's still got a hat, he has a hat on and a sweater, and he can still talk. He's a boy, it turns out, that's been half transformed into a jackass, a braying jackass, prior to being enslaved. And so that's another thing that's quite interesting about the story. You know, it also makes the case that if you replace your voice with stupid braying, that the probability that you're going to become enslaved by a tyrant is extraordinarily high. And I always can't help but think about ideologues in that manner. You know, Solzhenitsyn wrote about the radical left ideologues that got thrown in the Gulag archipelago. You know, so they were party stalwarts. This happened to a lot of people. True believers who were vacuumed up by the Stalinist machine and thrown into the Gulag anyways. And he said that those people suffered in some ways more than everyone else because, what did he say? They were bit by the beloved hand that fed them. And so the first while when they were in the camps, Solzhenitsyn really didn't know what to do with people like that, because on the one hand, well, they were in the camps and wasn't that awful, and they'd been torn away from their families and, you know, stripped of all their identity and their status, and so that's pretty rough. But on the other hand, they were writing letters protesting their innocence and assuming that everyone else in the camp was guilty, but they were innocent, and they were still strident believers in the communist process. And so, you know, it was a conundrum. Here they are being terribly punished, but by the same token, they're also the perpetrators of their own demise. So how do you deal with them? And they used to play comrades. He said they used to play comrades with people like that and invite them into an ideological discussion about the camp situation and the situation in the country as a whole, and let them rattle out their ideological justifications for everything that had happened in trying to make them parody themselves, roughly speaking. It was a rough game. And Solzhenitsyn also concluded that there was no helping someone like that when they were still ensconced inside that braying ideology. You could predict everything they were going to say. It's like someone had a crank. You could just crank it and out would come the proper ideological formulas. But then he realized that as soon as they, let's call it, repented of that and started to realize their own role in it or the error of the system, then he would start communicating with them, you know, as if they were people who you could communicate with. Yeah. So that was very interesting as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, this kid is still a little bit human. He starts to cry for his mom, and the coachman basically throws him back into the crate and says that he's not ready yet. And the reason for that is that he still had the power of independent speech. You remember, right at the beginning of the movie, when the mouth was painted on Pinocchio, we saw that mask that was really glaring at the process. And I said that character recurs continually throughout the movie, and this is a good example of that, because the coachman is the enemy of anything that has its own voice. So he's the anti-Geppetto. That's a good way of thinking about it. He's the tyrannical aspect of the culture. But insofar as one of these mostly donkeys, mostly jackasses can still talk, then they're not completely fit for slavery. And you remember this movie was also being made at about the same time that the Nazi transformation of Germany was taking place. And so all these terrible underground things, you know, this process whereby people were being reduced to ideological slaves, say, and in this terrible process that was all playing out in Europe in a very big way. And it's not like people weren't aware of that, you know, it was in the air. So anyways, the donkeys, the jackasses that can still talk, are crying and complaining and repenting and the coachman turns into a full tyrant again and cracks a whip, if I remember correctly, and says, you've had your fun and now you're going to pay for it. So the cricket gets word of all this, he gets wind of it, he starts to understand what's happened is that all these bad kids were enticed out onto this island so that they could be enslaved. And he's really taken aback by that, to say the least, but he realizes what's going on, so he runs back to find Pinocchio. And then the scene switches back to the 8-ball bar where Lampwick is drinking beer and complaining about what the conscience said. You know, because he's kind of guilty and ashamed, but he won't admit it, because he doesn't admit anything. He knows everything. He's not going to admit anything about himself that isn't perfect. He's a real totalitarian in training. And he drinks this beer and he's laughing about the conscience and putting him down. And then he says, well, what does he say exactly? What does he think I am, a jackass or something like that? Maybe that's not the words exactly. And then he grows these ears. And Pinocchio sees that and immediately takes a look at the beer and stops drinking it. And then Lampwick transforms one more time and his face turns into the face of a donkey. And he's laughing still. And then his hands, oh yes, he laughs and he starts to bray like a jackass. And he's horrified by that. And then Pinocchio laughs and the braying comes out as well. And so now they're absolutely horrified. And Lampwick actually figures out what's going on. He figures out that he's been tricked and that he's transforming, and he's completely horrified by it. He becomes conscious of what's happening to him. And there's one particularly, I would say, dramatic scene where his hands have transformed into hooves and he's kicking and leaping around the room in panic. And he comes up to a mirror and sees himself as a jackass, and then he turns around and breaks the mirror. And so, you know, he's self-conscious for a moment, then he destroys his capacity for self-consciousness, then he transforms entirely into a jackass. He's farther down the road than Pinocchio. And he comes crawling to Pinocchio to save him and asks that the conscience comes back so that he can get out of this, but of course it's a bit too late. And so then Pinocchio grows jackass ears, and he's absolutely terrified by it as well. He knows what's coming. And the cricket comes back and guides them off Pleasure Island. And so then they end up on a cliff, because this is an island after all, and they have to jump into the unknown, right? Out of this impulsive, adolescent, hedonic playground into the unknown. And that's how they escape. So that's the first time that Pinocchio has to leave. This is the first scene where he has to jump into the water to make a clean break from something pathological. So tyranny, you see this echoed, you see echoes of this in the story of Moses leading his people from Egypt, because Moses is a master of water, right? He hits a rock with a stick and water comes out of it, and he's floating on water when he's an infant, and he parts the Red Sea. And so he's a master of water and transformation, and the Pharaoh's kingdom is represented as desert stone, roughly speaking. And so the idea there is that, well, the kingdom is solid ground, but it can be a tyranny, and the water is chaos, but it can be the thing that you have to leap into to free yourself from the tyranny. It's not like in the Moses story that comes easy, right? Because the Hebrews leave Israel, or leave Egypt, which is a terrible tyranny, and you think, well, that's good, they've escaped from the tyranny. But that isn't what happens. They escape from the tyranny, they actually end up somewhere arguably worse, because they're wandering around in the desert for 40 years. And it's a brilliant element of that story, because it states clearly that when you go from a bad place to a better place, you go to a worse place first. And it's a great thing to know, because it also tells you why you might be unwilling to take the next step. You know, you're aiming up, but in order to aim up, you have to let go of something you already have. And then that'll put you into a state of chaos. And unless you're willing to undergo that intermediary state of chaos, and you might not recover from it, you're not going to get to the next level. So that's rough. Well, so Pinocchio, he decides that chaos is better than tyranny, and guided by his conscience, jumps into the water. And then we don't see anything happening in the water in this particular scene. They come back to shore all half drowned and exhausted by their adventure, and they go back home. And I think maybe we'll take a break now. Let's see, this is a good time to take a break. 1:30, perfect. So let's break for 15 minutes, okay? All right. All right, so